Mr. Jones is coming back in the garage. Perfect. All right. We'll get the car out on the flat part of the driveway. Seems to work out okay. My adrenaline's pumping because Joe almost killed me. All right, let's get it outside, and we'll take some pictures of it out here because Joe, you haven't seen it out in the daylight, have you?
No.
All right. We got to compound that right rear quarter on the Mustang too. It's got some rub marks on it. Well, we just spent 3 hours, I think, moving cars around outside. Hot. We moved everything. The Mustang's back outside. The Le Mans is back outside. Another friend's car is here. That's outside in the trailer that this was in. And Mr. Jones is back in the shop. Joe is just kind of brainstorming, and I'm going to sit here and relax a minute. The next project is the rear. Because everything else underneath this car is minty. Everything underneath this car is really pretty nice. Rear is not yet rebuilt. So that's what we are doing next, and we're probably gonna pull the rear end out, I think. These are all boxes of parts I can get started on. The pedals, the wiper motor, the gas pedal. What else do I have in here? The master cylinder. I have all kinds of things that I could get started on myself. We can start putting nice new restored parts just like we did the steering box. It does my heart good to have this car back in here because I have a lot of time and effort in this car, and as much as I needed it out of the way so I could get to the other cars, it's important to me and to Joe and to John. And I guess to a lot of you viewers. I guess we've been getting some comments. Where's Mr. Jones? What's happening with Mr. Jones? Well, everything you just saw between the engine and skid mark and the engine and clutch and the Mustang and the torque converter and the convertible and the brakes and the Le Mans, all that crap had to get done. And relative thrash mode, we got it done, and now it's time to buckle that back down to what people expect us to do, which is save the car that started really the channel. All right, we'll do some brainstorming here. We'll bring you back when we have something to share. Am I supposed to be recording or you're recording?
Recording.
He's recording with the actual official recording device. Rear end's out of Mr. Jones. A couple hours ago, this thing was out in the car trailer. Now it's got no rear end in it. Last of the major rusty drivetrain parts. I shouldn't say that. First of the drivetrain parts, because we still got a transmission and engine, but this will start making a final detailed rolling chassis.
Yesterday we pulled the rear end out of Mr. Jones, and today we're going to talk a little bit about what that rear end is.
Pretty exciting stuff that we've made it through all the other projects that I wanted to take care of, requiring putting this car out back for a little while. So yesterday we celebrated by getting it inside and pulling that rear end out, because it's go time. But let's do exactly what Joe said. Let's bore you people with what an Oldsmobile rear is. Look, a lot of people out there have read about it. This is my wiper arm pointer, by the way. A lot of people can go and read online what an O rear end is. But as often is the case, we would be remiss if we didn't tell you what we know about an Oldsmobile rear end. An Oldsmobile rear end is different than a Chevy rear end. An Oldsmobile rear has 12 cover bolts. It's a very easy way to identify a Chevy 12 bolt by the cover bolts. An Oldsmobile rear, aka O rear, starting at the top. They brought this rear end out in 1967 to 1970. It's basically the years that you're going to find this in the GMA bodies that we play with. Unlike a Chevy rear, you cannot definitively determine the ring gear bolt count by the cover bolt count. Chevys have 12 bolts in the cover. That means it's got 12 bolts holding the ring gear to the carrier. A Chevy 12 bolt is 8.875. This O rear is 8.5 inches. While it has 12 bolts in the cover, it's only got 10 bolts, we'll show you that in a second, holding the ring gear to the carrier. The only other significant difference is this is not a C-clip rear. These axles, as Joe discovered yesterday whilst taking it apart, they bolt in with sealed bearings on the outside. Up until 1970, they had sealed bearings. 70, they had tapered oiled bearings, meaning the gear oil would be down in the axle housings, and that's how the outer bearings would get lubed. This iteration of the axle has sealed bearings, and again, we'll show you those in a second. What are the other differences? They'll bolt in. GMA body, control arm mounts are the same, coil spring mounts are the same, shock mounts are the same, overall width is the same, and the control arm bushing locations all the same. So you can put a Chevy rear in an Oldsmobile and vice versa. When you get it apart, you're going to basically, if you're dealing with a hot rod Oldsmobile, you're going to basically come across two different carrier numbers. The earlier version of the O rear is going to have a 672, and those numbers are going to be in between the webbing on the carrier itself. And that version, the 672, was with a 31 spline axle shaft setup. And it was for the 342 and up. When I say up, I mean numerically up. 342, 391, 433. The performance gear sets held that carrier number 672. In 68 through 70, it went to a 28 spline count, and what you'll see is a 588 carrier number, and that is in effect what we have in the Mr. Jones car. Again, sealed bearings. 1970 will have a 588 carrier, but will have tapered oiled bearings. There's also 3 different codes that you'll come across when playing with these O rear ends. These codes are stamped somewhere in this vicinity on the axle tube. We can show you this one, can we? If I pick this thing up. That's the remains of a TM. This is the location. There's the vent location, the coil spring perch. So in that general vicinity is going to be the stamped code. You're going to see either a TM, TO, or a TY. The TM is a 342 ratio, the TO is a 391, and the TY would be a 433. Pretty cool stuff. So where are we at with what we have? Oh, the other carrier numbers that you'll see, in addition to the 672, which is the 31 spline, 342 and up numerically, and the 588 like we have, you'll see a 671, and that's for the 323s and down, like 323, 308, the QBs probably got a 671, should have a 671, because the QB car is a 308 car.
Right.
The Rally 350 out back is a 323, so that's going to be a 671. And the other number will be a 673, but that's really designated for the 256 to 278, not performance related at all. I think the 308, even on your build sheet, it says performance axle. The 308 starts the performance series. Again. Yeah, I think that's what it says. Okay, so what do we have with Mr. Jones? We have a housing that has a part number 402227 with a date code of 35, the 35th day. And the carrier, again the 588, has a date code of 31. We definitely have 28 splines on the axles. We know it's a TM because we have the ring gear here along with the pinion gear to prove it. 41 teeth and 12 teeth. Incidentally, we did write down there, if you have a 342, you'll have 4112. If you have a 391, you'll have 43 teeth on the ring gear and 11 on the pinion. And a 433 will be 39 teeth on the ring gear and only 9 on the pinion gear. So let's show you where you'll see the casting number on the rear end housing. There's the 35, guys, for the date code while we're looking at it. And there's the 40, oops, I'm sorry about that, 402227. So that is the correct casting for the housing. And over here is the infamous 588 carrier. Now you can't put 391 gears or 342 gears on the carrier that supports the 323s and vice versa. You can't do that. You can't interchange those. And over here, if we look at the ring gear, can you zoom in on that, Joe? 1241. I like this pointer. It's a cool tool. 1241. So that's obviously a 342 setup. These are the clutch packs and an anti-spin carrier. Okay. And these are in effect the axle bearings that we're talking about, the sealed bearings. These are the bearing retainers that would hold the axle into the axle housing. This bearing has been replaced. That is a new Departure brand bearing. Happens to have come out of the right rear. And Rich, who I bought my car from years and years ago, he said these things like to eat right rear axle bearings. And here we have, coincidentally enough, a right axle shaft with a replaced axle bearing. I wish I knew more about what some of these marks may have meant on these axle shafts. I don't. Orange mark on the carrier, you know, does that tell everybody that this was a posi? Does that just mean that's who the inspector was? You know, the color that person was dabbing on parts at that time. We also have yellow here on the back side. We have yellow on the carrier. A little bit of yellow on the ring gear. I don't know what that stuff means. I wish I did. It might mean nothing. So I guess in closing, we have more parts coming. We're going to rebuild this with all new bearings, obviously new clutches. And we're going to reuse this 342 gear set. There's no reason to put we have 391s in my car. But again, you know, that's originally a 342 car also. So we're not going to re-gear this car because Joe wants to be able to rip it. You know, kind of drive this thing a little bit more than just around town. So I guess there's the thing. Maybe Joe will pen that over that one more time. Try to simplify it a little bit. There you have it. All right. So it's official and work has resumed on the Mr. Jones W-31 project, and I have begun to start prepping this entire rear axle assembly for restoration. Now, what I'm doing is changing these at this point, removing these upper bushings. You know, you hear horror stories about guys trying to push the bushing out all at one time and cracking the ears on these cast housings. I don't want to do that. So what I do is I just do nice and easy. You know, this isn't a production shop, so I'm not worried about beating book time or anything. The first thing I want to do is I push out this bolt retainer. This inner sleeve. Now we did this for the control arm bushings for those that watched those videos. This is exactly how I got them apart without trying to press this whole thing out. Just put a bolt inside the bolt sleeve, okay? And use various spacers and exhaust pipe adapters that you may have to simply, or washers, that the spacer will fit through. Let me show you here. This washer here will fit right around that inner bolt sleeve. Stack up some nice stuff like a regular press arrangement would be, and push this bolt sleeve out. Okay? Now we're dead, because there's 3 components that make up a control arm bushing. The outer bushing body, the actual bushing itself, and then the bolt sleeve. So now we've taken one of the variables, and this is really hard. This is really hard, and this will prevent when you are trying to use an air hammer or something and compress this outer bushing shell to come out, you're never going to collapse that bad boy. That thing is rugged. So get that out of the equation. Just press it right out of the bushing. No big deal. Then I take a nice big drill bit, like this one, and just drill that bushing right out until it's something like this. Then it's really, really malleable, really soft and malleable. You take your air chisel rather, brap, 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 push the bushing out, and now we've removed 2 of the 3 components. Okay? Now we're down to just the outer bushing body, the actual shell. So when I get this bushing out, we'll flip the diff onto its face here. And then we'll just take our air chisel and kind of sort of collapse this shell and walk them out. 'Tis the plan. Let me get this bushing out here after I drill it, and we'll get to it. It got a little rammy here. I actually started using my foul language a little bit, so we've omitted that from the video file. So, look, this is another big step in that these are the last of the bushings original to this car. In summary here, creating your own weakest link helps ensure that the cast ears on the differential housing are not indirectly becoming your weakest link. I would say easiest, certainly a little bit harder, and this, of course, is the most difficult portion. I ended up taking my little die grinder, cutting some relief cuts in there just to encourage the bushing to collapse. I think what I've done in the past, too, is I've actually even taken a Sawzall and I've just done a whole scribe in here to actually take up, a little bit of space. When you take the blade out of there, you'll have the 1/8 of an inch or so of the blade width to collapse that shell. All told, including cleaning up tools, 1 hour. Not that big a deal. And nothing is cracked. Everything is apart the way it needs to come apart. So we're obviously not going to put new bushings in here right away because we're going to clean and detail this whole thing. It's going to get new pinion bearings and races and all that stuff. It'll be a completely rebuilt, not just looking the part. We are not going to replace the gears like I've said. Spider gears are good. We're going to keep the 342 gears, but it will get new carrier bearings and crush collar and all that stuff. Things will start looking as nice as the coil springs look. But this was a good project to get done tonight because it's the last of the nasty rubber stuff. Then we'll get into pushing off, pressing off, removing the axle bearings. With any luck, this thing is, back on its wheels before too long. What I want to do this morning is just prep everything for actually putting new parts on, and it starts with getting off the carrier bearings. This is what we have. We have one of these, wedge style bearing pullers. Now, you can draw these bolts in and attempt to pop the bearing up off its seat, but oftentimes what happens is you deform the bearing too much and you can actually start curling this whole puller up, which is no bueno. So I kind of draw this in as tight as I feel comfortable. I got an 1.1/8" socket sitting there on the actual carrier, and I fashioned these plates. You guys have seen these plates that I've had from one of our deck jobs that we did. I use these plates for everything. Lifting engines, lifting bodies, all kinds of cool stuff. So these are drawn tight, and what we're going to do is we'll take our 15/16 socket off. That's used for those. And we'll put our 3/4 socket on here, and I have everything kind of WD'd and whatnot. Actually, I'm gonna move that socket just a little bit more. Yep, that's good. good, and you're going to see this bearing walk right up. There it is. That's the old bearing off of there. I'll show you guys. And look, see, you deform the heck out of that bearing cage. But when you're drawing that tool in, you want to make sure that as you get the bearing lifted, you can get those clamps in there a little bit more to get underneath that actual inner race. That's what you want. So there we have it. They haven't been off since, 1969. I guess I should say that this same style puller will work for the pinion bearing, but you'll need to use a regular gear puller unless you have really long bolts. I'll show you what I did here to get this bearing off. I don't know why I didn't think to record it. I was just kind of getting it done. So this bearing obviously lives down on the bottom here, right by the gear. So you kind of tighten this bad boy up like so. Get it in there good and tight, and then use a regular gear puller. And I just kind of set the gear puller on the end of the pinion shaft and the jaws on the underside of the puller here. Keep everything lubed, all your threads lubed. I know we've mentioned it in the past. You don't want to be fighting friction in the threads on a puller. So my experience is such that grease everything up. Get the WD-40 going. I do like this PB Blaster Max for all kinds of cool things. And then there is a shim there, which we don't want to wreck. And then, when you're tightening up these nuts on these threaded shafts, even where the puller spins on the end of whatever is stationary, keep everything lubed. You don't need the friction of all that. And then you just kind of pop the bearing in place. I'm certain I got a piece of metal in that finger again. Okay, so now we have the pinion bearing off. Things go like that. So we're going to just keep on moving. I think I'm moving over to axle shafts next. All right, so Big J stopped over and helped me get the bearings off the axle shafts. We'll get to that in a second. You saw me pull the bearings off the carrier. That was relatively uneventful, as was getting the bearings off the pinion gear. We intend to reuse these 342 gear sets here. Now, what I tried to do for the sake of YouTube was I tried to put these axles in my press. And I wanted to really nicely and delicately pull these bearings and the bearing retainers off. Now, I was unaware, because I hadn't opened the box yet, that the new bearings automatically came with the retainers that Joe got. I'm not sure of the brand. A brand, quite honestly, I've never heard of. But that's good, because that allowed me to take the bearings and the retainers off like normal, which is you just sacrifice everything and beat the hell out of it all to get it off. Take a cutoff tool, put a groove in it, and split the retainer so you can slide the retainer off. Let me show you. Like this. Imagine this as a whole axle bearing, because obviously it's destroyed now. So the axle bearing would go down onto that seat, and then this is the outer retainer, and then there's this. Basically looks like a big spacer, almost like a front caster off a walk behind lawnmower or something, right? This is the inner bearing retainer. Now, to be perfectly honest, like I said, I tried to pull these off and use my press to get them off nice and neatly to show how a civilized person can take them apart. Oldsmobile has a better idea. They don't want you to be civilized. They just want you to be an animal and tear stuff apart. So that's what we did. The right axle shaft has had a replacement bearing already. We talked about that when we took things apart. So this was, in fact, the original axle bearing and pretty stuck to the shaft. So now all we have to do is clean things up. Once everything is all cleaned, we can start playing around with reassembling the carrier with new clutches, etc. So just going to spend the next, rest of the day cleaning parts, I guess. John made this great stand for holding up a differential housing. It's awesome, and it's even got a little area for a catch tray. The inner oil seal on an O-type rear is tough to get to because, you know, it's got a sealed bearing out here. So what I do is you take a wooden dowel when you have the rear end apart, and you slide the wooden dowel into the rear, and you get behind that seal. And now from in here, you can take your hammer and tap the seal out, you know, without putting a big pry bar or something in there. Or the reason why I'm saying you can't really use a regular seal puller is because when this thing is installed, it's kind of way down in there, and you can't really get leverage on your seal puller to pull that out. Now, there was a tool you can put in there and it spreads out and pulls it out like almost like a pilot bearing puller. But that's more advantageous, I guess, when the rear end is assembled and there's a carrier and a ring gear and stuff in here, because you can effectively do my method when that's all there, but obviously you got to pull the axle out. So I'll just take my wooden dowel, nice and neat, get behind that seal. There it is. There it is. All right, last two parts came out. The pinion bearing races, they're done. This is now a 100% empty axle housing. No bushings, no seals, no bearing races, no nothing. Cleaned up inside. Now I'm going to unfortunately I had this sandblasted when we had the frame sandblasted because it was in it. I really don't want to incur the expense to have this whole thing sandblasted by itself. So gonna just get to wire wheeling here and see what it looks like. We're gonna detail this thing in a way that I'm not yet decided on how it's gonna come out. We're gonna do it thoroughly painted. Am I gonna put some factory style blems in it? Unsure. But it'll talk to me. Let me get to wire wheeling and clean it up. I'll bring you guys back when it's a little prettier. All right, so it's Friday. The girls are away for the weekend. I'm going to play hooky. And I'm just going to stay in the garage and work on the rear end for Mr. Jones here. So I refrained from doing a lot of video because I wanted to make a lot of progress. And I'm sure that you guys can understand that the more you run the camera and the more you talk, the less productive it is. So I went ahead and I just replaced the clutches in that carrier. I say just. You're going to have a day in this. By the time you clean it, you pull the bearings off, you know, the carrier bearings, you pull them off, clean everything up, disassemble it, dissect the clutches, you're going to have a day. And that includes putting it back together. This is what a clutch pack looks like in an O rear, okay? We've talked about what an O rear is, so let's not be redundant. Joe and I are trying a new method here of trying to only say things once, maybe twice. Each side of the clutch pack is going to consist of 4 tabbed clutches. Tabbed meaning you're going to have these wings on here, okay? And then you're going to have 3 regular round clutches. Now these have a nice, almost like a machine surface, like a machine turn. Let me get a rag here. That's what gives the friction to the clutches. The new ones just have like a hex pattern in there. These are from Ron's machine. sometimes things go together the way they're supposed to in the book. And other times you have to just throw the specs out because you're using aftermarket clutches and you're using used ring and pinion 342 gear set, including the spider gears. They're out, obviously original as well. This is what the O rear looks like up close and personal. And that S spring is what actually pushes these gears up towards the clutches, okay? You have to make this as tight as you can so you don't have excessive gear lash in here. But the tighter you make it, the more you're going to spread these spider gears to the sides, okay? Imagine if you have shims underneath these clutches. It's going to thereby push that pinion gear towards the center. And as it does that, it's going to push these spider gears out, okay? I said pinion gear, I meant spider gear. But in any case, when you push them out, you can't get the thrust washer that's in there. It's like a stainless. Can you see that in there, that thrust washer? So you have to kind of play the game, man. You got to just put it together so that it goes together. Because if this gear is too high in the carrier, you're not going to get your pin in. It's just not going to happen. And that's going to be because you have too many shims on one side or the other. You know, you should not have to slam the hell out of this with a hammer to get it in, because obviously that means it's dragging somewhere. So get your clutches in. You know, I soaked them in oil the night before. Everything did ultimately go together fine. If anybody has any questions, I guess you could let us know. But it's fairly basic, albeit time consuming. You know, you pull your set bolt out, you drive your pin out, you can then pull out your S spring. Once you do that, you kind of walk these spider gears out, and then your actual axle gears will just slide towards the center of the carrier and you can pull them out. So what I'll do now is I'll set the whole carrier here in the press, and I'm going to put new axle bearings on here. Okay, so before I break for lunch, let's show you guys what I've gotten done. Not a whole lot. The front pinion bearing race is in. The rear pinion bearing race is in. The trick that I ended up doing here, as I'm sure a lot of you have done, put those races in the freezer, put a little heat, just cast iron, just a little heat in there, and those races will effectively fall right in. The front one did. The inner one, or the rear one, was a bit of work. I had to give it the old tappy with the driver. Okay, so here's where I'm at right now. If you're going to do the wrong thing, at least do your best, right? So I have notes upon notes, and I've been measuring the original spacers. These are the production spacers that you'll see in an O rear if you take one apart that's never been taken apart. They are made out of cast iron. They have marks on them, and it's easily identifiable. This one has 5, and the left side has 4 somewhere in here. They don't want you to, there it is. They don't want you to reuse these, because upon installation, tappy, you can crack these things. So they say. Now, I've seen guys reuse them. The new Yukon set that we have bought comes with these cool, like, 2-piece style. Let me show you. It's kind of like a hat type shim. I got a little bit of oil on here. See, it's got like a recess in there, and then you put the shim stack that you need, and then there's a little cap that goes on there. Now, when I say that you need, it's because you measure these. You measure these with a micrometer, and you take your measurements, and you attempt to use the variety of shims that they give you. You attempt to get something that's close to that. Now, you still got to be able to get it together. It's just like setting that carrier up, okay? You have to be able to get those shim stacks on either side of the carrier bearings. I'm using the original ring and pinion, so here's what I'm going to do with respect to the pinion gear shim. I'm using the one that it came with. I don't have that special tool to mount inside the carrier tubes, the axle tubes, so that I can determine some sort of a center line here and then lay the bearing in there and measure the depth from that center line, subtracting the width or half the width of that shaft that you would put in there to the bearing. And that's how you would get your rough pinion bearing depth. I have no idea how this rear end sounded, how this rear end performed. We're taking a risk in that we're going to put all new bearings and new seals, but we're going to reuse the original 342 gear set. These marks that are on the pinions from the factory, they are part of the assembly process. So they start telling the technician who's building it what shims they want to use. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel in that respect. Not interested. So we're going to put it together with new bearings. That shim, we'll torque it to specs. We'll get our nice inch pounds there. Pinion will be done. Then we'll just play around with our left and right to get our gear lash as close to what we want. All right, somebody give me an A for today, huh? Pinion bearing is in with the new seals, new oil seal, new bearings, new races. So the spec is, if you're using new bearings, 24 to 32 inch pounds. If you convert that over to Newton meters, John bought this nice spring-loaded Newton meter gauge. It's like 3.6. And that's exactly what I have the preload set to here on the pinion bearing. Pinion gear. Pretty good. Pretty good. I think I'm running out of steam here. This whole thing has been kind of fighting me. Lots of burrs on the pinion gear. And I actually had to play around with getting the races in there. It was a little bit of a challenge, but made a tool to hold the pinion in place as I was tapping the front bearing into place. So a lot of those little things along the way, but I guess I was doing my homework. I don't know. This thing just fell right into place. The shims, everything just went right in. I mean, a little tiny bit snug, but nothing I couldn't push in with my knucks. So let's put some bearing caps on here and just see how the thing spins. We'll clean it all off and have to put the marking paint on there. But if you turn pinion, there's the carrier turning. So let's get some bearing caps on and just see how things feel. Like I said, I always catch another little wind after I turn the camera off and say, man, if I could just finish this one little thing. So I dropped the carrier in. I torqued the bearing caps to 65 foot-pounds. The spec on the gear lash, of which there is a little here, the spec, according to an old service manual here, is 0.005 and 009. I have 0.0052. Let's see if I can hold this thing together. I'm moving everything, but it's like 0.0052 is what I had before several times. So what am I going to do? The enemy of good is better. I think that's going to be it. You know, they do say to take the caps off, pull the shims out, take one shim out of each side at a time, and they want you to add a shim that is 0.004 bigger than one that you remove on the left, and then do the same on the right. Now, I'm of the opinion that step is for brand new gears because you want them to be a little bit tight, so when they wear, you're within specs. I'm going to clean this up, and we're going to put marking paint on it. And I'm pretty sure we're going to have a wear pattern that's consistent with what was in there, because basically, other than new bearings, which might be in a little different spot, I think this thing is as good as it's going to get. The unfortunate part is we are years away, unfortunately, before we fire this. Oh, I get some sirens going on. Before we fire this car up and take it for a ride. So we won't know until we know how it feels. But that's a big, long day. Tomorrow, I will put the axle bearings on and slide the axles in. I got a little bit of sandblasting to do. I got backing plates and stuff to clean and paint. So I got coffee with the boys in the morning. We'll do a little bit of cleaning up, but I do look forward to nights home alone because I get to just hang out with the cats, watch TV, which I'm not really good at. And then I kind of watch TV and go on YouTube at the same time. This is what it looks like when you don't have a paint booth. Leaves are falling, bugs are flying. I don't want to do it outside. So I'm going to look at these beautiful pollinators over here on my flowers. You see them buzzing all around? All right, going to paint the rear diff. Gonna wipe it with thinner. Gonna put a primer surfacer on it to try to fill some of these pits. I am gonna tape off that yoke and that dust seal on there because I don't want any paint on that. And we'll have to just touch up when I get in there to do those control arm bushings. So let's wipe it down. The cover is just sitting here because I do want to paint that kind of at the same time. We're gonna just probably do like a polished bolt or something on there for cool aesthetics. I don't know if I'm gonna go through the craziness of, you know, painting it all gray and then doing just, you know, the factory black from the backside, allowing overspray on the front. You know, at the end of the day, this is not an all-out show car. This is going to be something that ultimately Joe's going to drive. And painted stuff is easier to maintain. So I think that's what we'll do. All right, let me wipe this thing down, tape off that yoke, and put some color on this thing. All right, finally, let's get some paint on this thing. I did play with the gear lash a little bit more, you know, messing with old gears. So we're gonna put a little bit of primer surfacer on here and try to cover some of these pits. That's the last of the, see those 3 hash marks right there? That's the last of the TM code on here. TM 342, TO 391, and TY for 433. So we're just gonna put a little coat of primer on here. We'll go back and blow some more leaves. All right, looking better already. Those pits are really, really deep. I laid that primer on pretty heavy. And no, I'm not gonna sand it between coats. That's it. And we are just gonna go black. Let's hope this rear end works well. All right, we're gonna let that flash out, and I'm gonna hit that with another coat. It's obvious half of this thing was in the friggin' dirt when it sat for all those years. So we're gonna give this a couple days to dry. We will then start putting parts on it. You know, we'll put the new axles in and the little vent tube thing that, you know, little vent that Joe got me, control arm bushings, etc., etc. But I have the bearings and the bearing retainers ready to be installed. Just because of timing, I went ahead and made some axle bearing retainer plate gaskets. No big deal. But I want to press these on using the hydraulic press. And there is a retainer that holds the outer axle bearing in place on the. So this retainer slides on like so. And what I want to do is I want to set this inverted, you know, with the wheel studs up, and press down, pushing the axle basically into the stationary retainer. So what I'm gonna do is go to yet another one of these plates. Love these things. And I'm gonna drill a hole in the plate that is a little bit larger than the inside diameter of that bearing retainer. And in this case, the drill bit that I'm using here, this is one of those Chinesium ones, and it's Can't even read it. I think it says 35 millimeter. So that means that it corresponds to the 1 3/8. Okay? Going to drill the hole in there so that this retainer is going to sit like that on the plate, and then we're just going to drive everything in one shot. So let me drill this hole and show you how I think it's going to go together. That worked perfectly, that hole in the plate that I drilled. Look at that. See, the axle shaft fits right through that perfectly. But the retainer, this bearing retainer here that I'm wiggling my pinky on, that retainer sits on that steel plate perfectly. And then you can just delicately, I got some smudges on the lens, I'm sorry, delicately push that bearing onto that axle shaft. This is just a piece of wire holding the bearing retainer out of the way so you can kind of watch what you're doing. And I used an old carrier bearing to just kind of push on that axle flange. So we're good to go. One down, one to go, and then maybe I'll put the seals in and slide these bad boys in. All right, you might have missed me pressing that last axle together. Again, I thought I had it in the forward gear, as it were, on the phone, but no way. So these are pretty cool little bolts here. These bolts are flattened on the one side, and that's because they rest up against the axle housing. So I reused the original ones, and this is so you can just kind of put them in, and then they're not going to spin on you. But, you know, that's kind of the look that we're going for there. I guess you could use, if you didn't have them, you could use the original, you could use a regular bolt, and then just kind of grind it flat. But that's what they're supposed to look like, almost like a nail, right? Well, before I get too far ahead of myself, let's put the new oil seals in. This is the seal that actually keeps the gear oil in there and not out to that sealed bearing. This is what got basically eliminated in the next iteration of this rear, so that the gear oil would actually lubricate that axle bearing. In this case, is a sealed bearing, so in effect, no oil is supposed to get to that bearing. Certainly no oil is supposed to get out through here. So if you're paying attention and you're playing the game right, this is what you're going to end up with. Backing plate onto the axle housing with those fancy nail looking bolts that are, you know, cut off flat on one side. New axle oil seal inserted. And now we're ready to slide the axles through all of this business into the carrier, and then we can start through all of this business, I should say, into the carrier, and then we can start bolting those, putting the nuts on for those bearing retainers. And you'll just have the axle flanges hanging out there. So we're gonna set the backing plate on here. And I had this backwards. I had the gasket on the inside of the backing plate. And I really don't want that, because you want a gasket between the axle housing and the backing plate, because that's where, you know, some debris and stuff could get inside this housing and basically rust the bearing in place. Ultimately, it doesn't pay to have a gasket here because there's a weep hole designed and machined into the flange of the bearing retainer. So you're not going to be gasketing that anyway. This is where the gasket would go. Just like this. So let's see if we can't get this on like that game of Operation when we were kids. Boom! There it is. Okay, whatever order you saw it is the order that I wanted you to see it. Gasket's got to go between the backing plate and the axle housing. That only makes practical sense, especially because of the weep hole in that rear bearing retainer plate. So that's all put together. Covers on it. I think what I'm going to do is try to restore this thing for the sake of originality. Use limited slip diff lube only. Can you see that? So let's see if I can't knock it back into shape with my trusty ball peen. And we'll put a little polish on it. I don't want to hit it too hard because these are just stamped raised letters. So maybe I'll get my, my bath bag, leather bag out. See if I can't coerce this thing into looking something a little bit more conducive to what we're after here. Boy, that looks like a total piece of junk, huh? Looks like and it's even torn here. See how it's torn? Let's see right there. No promises, but let's see. Trusty ball peen. I'm gonna have to kind of get that to curl over. I'm gonna have to take it over to my little anvil here. Okay, Friday night thrash mode. I really just hate having parts laying around on the workbenches, and the rear end was ready to receive new parts. So I just kind of got home from work and got right after it. Let me show you what I've done here. So my apologies in advance for not really taking a whole lot of video. You saw the backing plates and the bearings go in. That's really the hard stuff. You know, lacing brake lines, kind of rudimentary. Pressing in the control arm bushings. I use John's tool, great tool. I put the bushings in, you know, without much hassle at all. Brake hose, vent. These are the original bump stops from Mr. Jones. Joe popped them out, I cleaned them up, popped them back in. That's the original tag. It's even though I straightened it out. Look how it bent, exactly how it was. So, it's kind of meant to be. I like a little bit of bling, so I just polished up the original bolts, soaked them in the juice I like to soak them in, and we also have new parking brake cables. This, you know, there's nothing to save there, so the brand new, as I fall over, the brand new parking brake cables were a necessity, not just a pretty thing. So here we have it. There's even the fill plug, the yoke. Everything looks pretty good. I hope my little trick of putting some oil pressure gauge line on the runners here, kind of giving the rear end somewhere to slide on. Boy, it's really looking pitted in these videos. Sometimes things look better in videos, sometimes they look worse, sometimes they look exactly the same. I would say this pitting is pretty accurate. Wish I could tell you it doesn't look that bad in person, but you know, half of this rear end was sunk in the dirt, I'm sure of it. So the fact that we saved it is good enough for me. So there is an O-type rear for a 69 W car, 342. If you look here close somewhere, that is the last. See those straight lines? That's the last of the TM stamp. So, other than brakes, brake parts, including wheel cylinder, shoes, hardware, and I got to get brake drums kind of cleaned up for it. Other than that, this rear end is basically ready to go back in the car. So, all right, that's a pretty decent wrap on it. I don't want to go any more about rear end work on the car, okay? So the next video you see regarding this rear end will be when it's back in the underside of that car. All right, thanks for watching. Click the subscribe if this thing turns into a video, or it gets to a video rather. Click subscribe, share it. We need all the help we can get. Thanks for watching.